Have you ever sat and stared up at the stars and wondered, where did we come from? Let's take a journey like no other, not to a place, but to a time. Join us as we delve deep into the human past and explore our shared human origins. Welcome to the world of paleoanthropology.
Hello, everyone. This is Seth from the world of paleoanthropology, and today we are joined by a wonderful guest, Genevieve von Petzinger, and I will hand it over to her to introduce herself because she's got some pretty interesting stuff to say.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me, Seth. I mean, I feel like this has been an interview that's like two or more years in the making. Like we've been trying to make this work. So I'm here. I'm so excited. I love the
Yay!
interviews that you do. I know. I feel like we need a little party. Um, so no, what we were talking about right before you started recording was just that, I mean, I think this kind of outreach is so important because we want to not just find stuff, we want to share it with the world because as your show is called, this is the story of us, right? But us is not just English language speakers. So I thought I would temporarily torture yourself and all of our viewers with me also doing it in some of the other languages I speak, because I'm really committed to wanting to be able to do outreach, not just in English. But I'm not good in everything. So bear with me, but I will try. I'm going to introduce myself in the four languages I speak to some degree of functionality. All right. So first of all, in English, of course. My name is Genevieve. I'm a paleoanthropologist and a rock art researcher, and I study cave art from the Ice Age, in particular the geometric signs, which I find a really fascinating way to get at the origins of symbolism, the modern mind, the first glimmers of writing. There's so many cool things going on there. But then also the bigger question of the movement of people and ideas. So that's sort of my approach to this. That was much longer than I will pull off in the other languages, but I will do a quick intro. And so first of all, I'll do French, which I could explain in French, but we won't go that detailed. Bonjour, je m'appelle Geneviève. Je suis une chercheuse et j'étudie l'art paléolithique. J'étudie les cavernes tout autour de le monde. Mais pour moi, ma cœur, c'est toujours un peu de la France parce que c'était la première place où j'ai étudié l'art rupestre. So there we go. That was my friend. And I just gave a little shout out because France is the first place I ever actually got to see art in person. So
I
I told,
kind of thought I heard that in there.
yeah,
I don't
oh,
know French at all, but I think I
yeah.
heard that in
So I said
there.
my heart is always a little bit in France because it's the very first place I got to stand in a cave and oh man, just like that first, and the guides are really awesome and dramatic there
Mhm.
too. So it was like we're like tromping in the dark and it's dripping and it's a cave, and then he's like, sort of like halt, like stop kind of thing. And we stop, and then he's got his flashlight, and then whoosh up onto the wall, and there's a bison, and it was like that amazing moment though, right, where I'm like, I am standing in front of a carving that was made by a human just like me but almost 20,000 years ago. Like, that was the moment I was truly hooked. Like, I already thought it was
Mhm.
really cool, but that was when I was like, this is unbelievable. This is a way of like touching the past, of like talking to our ancestors. It's amazing. So, little piece of me will always be in France. Plus, they have excellent food. So, that's always, it's always a nice bonus of being in the field, right? It's very civilized. Um, let's do Spanish, okay? So, hola, se llama Hanovera. Soy un arqueóloga de los arte paleolítico y trabajo en las cuevas. Trabaja todo en España. Es un país muy, muy interesante por la historia de los humanos y neandertalos y otros. Las cavernas y el arte es muy antiguo y muy interesante. Es posible en el futuro, es un país muy importante por comprender todo de las historias. How's that? So, see, Spanish I can speak, but I'm not like, I hadn't spoken it out loud in a few years until I was in the field this last fall. Like, I
Mhm.
read in Spanish for like the articles and stuff, but I hadn't actually
Right.
spoken out loud. And so, but then I got to spend almost 6 weeks in Spain with my colleagues. And so, as usual, I just sort of hammer at it. Like, I just give it my best shot and hope for the best. And so I just found over that 6 weeks that the actual speaking part came back a bit. And I was like,
Right.
oh, I remember how. But I just sort of picked it up because I knew French quite well from school. In Spain, what I was saying was that the Spanish sites, I've worked in Spain for long chunks of field work, like months here, months there sort of style. And Spain is such a fascinating country, not just for the humans, but also for Neanderthals. Like, there's some really interesting stuff going on in Spain, especially down in the south. Like, as crazy it sounds, we can circle back to this, but it feels like there's some sort of Neanderthal culture down in the south, which maybe shows itself a little more clearly than we've been able to find in other places. So, I mean, I think that's what I was saying, was that the art in Spain is incredibly old. There's some sites that have some fantastically old dates, some really interesting art, and that I think it's going to play a really important role in the future of the field. So it's basically what I said in Spanish. For those who don't speak it. And I apologize to the good Spanish speakers. I tried. I'm sure I messed some stuff up. And then lastly, I'm going to do my newest language, which is Arabic. So again, I'm going to pre-apologize because I probably sound like a 5-year-old if I'm lucky. But I think it's important to try, right? And so this is where we're going to give it a shot. All right. Okay. So, مرحبا, اسمي جنيفيف أو مراد. أدرس الآثار الحجري، خاصة الفن القديمة في الكهوف. So what I said there was really brief. I just basically said, hi, my name's Genevieve, or Mother of All Thunder, which is my nickname from the Bedouin, best nickname ever. I basically just said I study the Stone Age, and I'm especially interested in cave art, well, in ancient art in caves. Funny story with that, though, is so Alima Athar is an archaeologist, which basically means a scientist of old stuff. Now, I don't know if they didn't correct me because they thought it was hilarious or they didn't want to embarrass me, but for months, dude, I was wandering around in the Middle East introducing myself because I was introducing myself as an ancient pen. So because the word for pen is alam, which is really close to alam, and I hadn't quite figured out the male-female thing yet. So alima is the female, but alam is the male. So I was like, marhaba, which means hi. I'm a kalam athar, which means I am an ancient pen. And people would look at me for a minute, and you can see the head tilt, like they're processing. And I'd say it a couple more, and then you can see they're like, oh, she means an ancient scientist. Oh, but it was like, but nobody was to me for months. So I was laughing super hard. But yes, so that is also, I not only study, apparently I'm also an ancient pen. But yeah, so I mean, I've been working in the Middle East as well lately. So slightly sidestepping out of Europe. So also something we can circle back to. But this is where again, I really want to be able to speak to people in their own languages. It's great with the English, of course, but that if we really do want to get the whole world excited about the story of us, then I like languages anyways, and so it's a fun way for me to kind of do outreach. So there you go. There was my really long intro, so hope that was okay.
Absolutely. I think that was wonderful and hopefully appreciated by a lot of people, because I know there are, of course, multilingual people who view this who unfortunately might lose out because I only speak English. I know sign ASL, but I don't think that will help too much in the interviews. So continuing on, I want to talk about, you briefly mentioned standing in that cave in France and seeing that bison was when you were locked in. I mean, you were locked in. But not everyone, as far as I know, can go into those caves. So what started what?
I said no, they can't. Yeah.
So what started that? What interested you enough to even get permission to go into the cave?
Well, okay, so it's funny story. So as an undergrad, and I think it goes again, you don't always know exactly what you want to do until it kind of finds you sometimes, right? And so this was where, as an undergrad, I knew I really liked ancient human stuff, and I was really interested in archaeology. But I hadn't like, again, locked in on the specific thing yet. I just knew I liked old things. So my first undergrad excavation, I'm sorry, I'm recovering from a cold, so I'm not as normally I don't have problems like this. It's children, they bring plagues home. Um, so when I was an undergrad, I was studying like different types of archaeology. My first undergrad opportunity to go on an excavation was actually to go excavate a Roman site in southern Jordan called Homeima. And so I was super excited. At that point I was pretty, again, liked old stuff, interested in archaeology, ancient history, humanity. Went over there. I mean, I had the time of my life in the sense that it was such an incredible experience to be in the field. But it was one of those things too where, I mean, I love the people over there. I love the language. I love the culture, and so it was also a great opportunity just to connect with a different part of the world. The Roman stuff. This is what's so funny. I mean, it was a really interesting site. I think it's the farthest south outpost of the Roman Empire. It's certainly one of them. Emperor Trajan. Yeah. So really neat point in history. But I remember excavating, and I'm like, this isn't old enough. Like, this is really nice, but I'm more interested in the beginnings of things. And this feels too organized. Like, this feels like we're too far into civilization at this point. Like, I'm like, I need to know more about what came before. The other thing I realized too, now back then I didn't know that I had ADHD, but now, I mean, it's one of those things that all makes sense, right? Later. But I was not very good at excavating. So here's what's so funny about being an archaeologist, right? Is you do these very minute, very detail focused tasks and it's super important. So I'm not blowing that off at all. Very important. You need these nice straight lines in your pit. You need like in your 1x1 and you need all the stratigraphy and all this stuff. That was really hard for me. Like I had a really hard time staying focused on that, but they gave me the chance to go surveying. So surveying is when you get to go look for new stuff. Blew my mind. I was like, this is what I want to do. So I think that's like maybe an important fact for people to understand is that there's lots of different versions of archaeology you can do. Like, not everybody has to have the fedora and the whip. Like, do you know what I mean? As funny as that sounds. Even though we were all like, oh, Indiana Jones was pretty much, was an influential character in pretty much all of our lives who were over there. But, there's a lot of different pieces of the puzzle when it comes to an archaeological team and to doing ancient historical research. And in fact, funny story, I study rock art. So most of my work is what we would call non-destructive archaeology because I don't excavate. I take photos of things. I scan stuff. Occasionally we take teeny weeny samples of things, but I don't do that excavation. Now, if we're working on a big project, I'm always very careful to have colleagues who are very good at these things. And that's the secret, is it's about the team, right? And so, no, I've got one colleague that, like, he showed up on, we were working in Abu Dhabi, and he shows up, he's got, like, Ziplocs with, like, little special, like, tags on them. He's got, like, I was like, this is the guy who needs to be in charge of excavating. This is perfect. So I think that was where, that was the moment where I realized, though, that this isn't old enough, but I absolutely love this. How's that? And that was kind of where I came back, and serendipitously, as last year of my undergrad, I took a course on Paleolithic art. And I'm like, oh, well, now you're old enough. This is interesting. And I kept seeing all of the little geometric signs everywhere. But it's funny to think, because it wasn't that long ago. I think the field's opened up in general. I would like to think maybe I've helped shift the conversation a little bit too. But people weren't talking as much about geometric signs back then. And they weren't the focus of the research as much. Like, people certainly looked at them, but more like in the context of a cave or like a little area. People weren't really doing the big pullback, which is the other thing I've understood too, is that I don't think I'm destined to work at a single site. I'm really interested in like the big picture of how the signs were interacting with the people at different caves at different times in different places. So that's maybe another piece of this as well, was that the signs instantly caught my attention just because they seemed like they were repeating, and they just seemed really intriguing. So that was the start point. Was I finished my undergrad, actually went off and worked for a couple of years because like so many of us had to pay for my own degree, so I had to go off and do some work but I couldn't stop thinking about the signs. And that was what drove
Mm-hmm.
me to go back and do a master's. And that was right at the point too, which again is going to sound so funny for all the digital babies, but archaeology wasn't doing a lot of databases back then. And this is like in 2007, so it's not like that long ago, but like it was fairly a thing for me to want to build a database was a fairly new thing still at that point. And isn't that funny to think? I know the world has moved so fast. So this is where
It really is.
I
Yeah.
had like really supportive supervisor stuff who were like, yeah, let's try this, but it just wasn't being done in the same way back then. And so that was really my first chance to look at a larger scale of data and to start noticing that. So three main things came out of that first thing. I wanted to do the whole of Europe even then, and they were like, scale it down, it's a master's. So I was like, fine, France, we'll do France. Um, and so I picked France because they had really good records already about individual sites. So I could draw on the data from different sites and then put it all into this one spot and then look for these big trends. So three big things came out of it for me, I think. Number one would be the fact that there was definitely patterns to how the signs were being used. Like they definitely, it wasn't a random thing. Like there was a sense of like certain times and places these things are happening. There was also very much a sense they were moving between regions, and so again there was a sense of choice being made and a purposefulness. There was also such an interesting thing to see that some signs were early, some were late, some got popular, some got untrendy. Like it was really interesting to see those trends take place too, that this was not just one set of signs. Like people were making choices
Mm-hmm.
and those choices changed over time. And then another thing was realizing what a small group were being reused. That the inventory they were choosing from again was limited. And now again, there's a few signs that kind of don't fit the main categories I created. I created 32. And again, I always think it's harder because it's like you're sort of picking like this is the baseline sign, and these are all the things that mostly look like, right?
Mm-hmm.
But most things fit into somewhat those categories. So again, that's not for a very big area, 30,000 years of prehistory, a continent basically. At this point, we're looking at France, but those patterns really pushed across the edges. And then the last thing that really, this is the one that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, was the realization that so many of those signs were already in use right at the beginning. Orignation period, early human arrival in Europe, those signs are already being used. And they're not being used like, hey guys, why don't we try this cool thing called making a line on a wall? No, they were already being used with the level of sophistication and familiarity, which really flagged for me that this came from somewhere else. And so those are probably the big things. And I mean, that was where, like, I was already hooked, but then at that point, I'm like, oh, this is like, there's things we can learn from this, which are not just applicable to France, but probably certainly to Europe. And even then, I was already like, we need to, I think in the future, I need to pull out farther and take a bigger look at where, when, who, why, what was going on, all the big questions.
That is just, I mean, it's so exciting and fascinating. And I mean, just from what you said, I know we talked about this before we started recording, and we won't talk too much about it because we don't have plans yet. But I think we might need more than one episode
Dude,
to
seriously.
go over everything because there is just so much to unpack. Uh, let's dive deep into some of the first questions that I
Yes.
saw, which hot button topic. First on, did Neanderthals make cave art?
Yes. I, I'm definitely team Neanderthal for sure. I have been for years. Um, but yes, my instinct is absolutely that they did. Maybe there are some questions about the uranium series dating that was used. So for any viewers who are maybe not completely familiar with the debate, the big issue with it has been that nothing's been directly dated. What we have been dating is we're using this new technique called the uranium series, where we're basically the calcite's that lovely translucent stuff that drips down in caves and makes cave walls, right? And so somebody made a mark on a wall. This comes down and covers it. There's a certain amount of natural uranium in the groundwater, and so it's there. And then over time, it does its radioactive thing and it decays in its half-life. So we can measure how it's decaying, and then we can figure out the date from there. So the cool thing is the fact that all we're measuring is the date it was covered up. It could be even older. So when we're getting dates like 65,000 years ago, that's when it got covered. And we've got 3 sites in France now. I mean, not in France. Woo, Spanish will kill me. I've been kicked out of the country, never allowed back. There's 3 sites in Spain where we have dates using uranium series that are 65,000-ish, around there, 63 to 65,000, when the art was covered up. Okay, so it could be even technically older. But where the fight comes in is because caves have stuff dripping, there's things happening, there's questions of contamination, right? Now, to me, right off the bat, the fact that we've got 3 caves, one in the north, one in the middle of the country, and one in the south, all pulling really similar dates, which is kind of, I mean, it could randomly happen, but it's weird. We have no other dates around 65,000-ish anywhere. Suddenly, we're getting dates from literally the far north, the middle, and the bottom, where they're very similar dates. So that in itself, to me, was like something to think about, because that's strange. We're not normally getting 65,000-year-old dates around art. Second of all, is the fact that since I studied the signs, very conveniently, so far everything that's been associated with Neanderthals, either on portable artifacts or, proposals on walls, it all is geometric signs. Which also means that I have the biggest database of where they all are, right? And it also means I've worked in caves where like El Castillo is a great example of this, is that I've worked in sites where there's one particular panel, which was obviously a very attractive panel to people, and people came back multiple times, and each group who came in made their own paintings or their own engravings on that same panel. The oldest ones, so they're always underneath everything else, very faded, very covered in calcite, there's these red discs in particular that you find in a number of caves, and they're always the oldest thing in the cave. Like, just by physical appearance, like, they look super faded, they're covered up, and they're always underneath other things. Like, they're never on top of stuff, if you know what I mean. Like, they're always kind of at that back layer. So that's really interesting. There's also, of course, in La Pasiaga next door to El Castillo. So this one mountain has like 4, it's got so many caves. It's got like amazing, it's actually got 5 caves, I think, with cave art. Pardon me. So La Pasiaga is next door. And again, I've had the privilege of working in both these caves. Like, I've been in them multiple times, which is amazing. La Pasiaga is where they dated a piece of calcite on what's called partially, and this was just a tiny piece, again, so it was like a little, almost looks like a little lettuce head. It's like a tiny little floret, I think they call it. And so it's a little piece of calcite covering a piece of the scalariform, which means ladder shape. But again, it's geometric. To me, that always seemed like the slightly weird one, because my impression with the Neanderthals, if you want my guess, is that I'm seeing what I would call, and I don't mean this in derogatory way, but the simpler signs tend to be associated with them, like dots, discs, maybe some hand meanders, possibly some negative hands as well. Again, because you get negative hands that are very old looking. And I think part of this is just a bit of an instinct you get, like, from being in so many caves. Like, I was counting it up the day. Isn't this incredible? I've worked in over 100 caves, like cave art sites. Isn't that insane? Like,
yeah.
I know, like, what an honor. Amazing. Second of all, it means that I've seen so much art in real life, in context, in different caves, that I often go into a cave and I'm like, this looks really familiar. This reminds me of the art that I think I saw. Like, my brain has to like my little inner database, right? And so I think it gives me a sort of unique perspective as well, which is, I'm like, wait, I saw this somewhere else. Where did I see this? So with the Neanderthals, like I said, I think some lines, dots, discs, maybe some hand meanders, some negative hands, things like that. I was like, okay, yeah, these are all making sense. The scalariform seemed a little bit funny to me, except this last year. I had the opportunity to go to Ardales down in the south, which is one of the other 3 caves. So there's La Pasiaga in the north with the little cauliflower floret thing. There's a site called Maltravieso in the center of the country, which has incredible hands and like blown spit painted dots, and it's an incredible site as well. And that one I did not go to. I sent two of my colleagues to go look at it. And I'm glad I did, because for both of them, I think it was an amazing experience. One of my colleagues who studies Neanderthals specifically, apparently she cried.
Aw.
Like she said, it was just a to be in there. And then Ardalis in the south is that third cave of those three with the 65,000-ish dates. So down in Ardalis, I got a chance to see the calcite in person, to see some nice chunky pigment right beside it, which they spat onto walls. And then just up from there, you kind of have to scramble across this area, which is almost like walking on ice. I mean, that's the funny thing about caves too. They're not always, they're safe-ish. Oh, they're safe-ish. Right? But you go to the spot where the Paleolithic entrance to the site is actually sealed now. Like, which, by the way, happens in a lot of caves. So that we're often, when we find them, we're finding some new thing that got opened, or they're building a road and they crack into the old entrance. But a lot of these entrances collapsed, and then the calcite drips down and covers it and seals in the entrance, right? So back in the day, that was the entrance. There's evidence of Neanderthals living in archaeological, like visiting the cave. There's evidence of Neanderthals from tools and other things right near the entrance to the cave. Here's the thing, though. So my colleague Pedro, who has been working at Ardalis for like 30 years, amazing man, Cantalejo, Pedro Cantalejo Duerte, I think is the correct pronunciation. I hope I did him justice. But you know, and he's so passionate about that site, and he's been talking for years about the Neanderthals and the culture in the cave and all the amazing things that are going on. And he's published lots of articles. But again, the south of Spain kind of gets like dissed a little bit for the north. Like everybody's like, oh, it's Cantabria. And again, I love Cantabria. I love my colleagues up there. But there's cool stuff in the south too, for sure. But we're looking at it, and he's like, I want to show you this. And he points up. Okay, are you ready for this? So here's the site. It's a fairly low ceiling. Neanderthals were hanging out here. There's the cave entrance. I look up. There's a scalariform right there.
Wow.
And instantly I'm like, it's La Pasiaga. Like, it was like this crazy moment for me where I was like, oh, wow, okay. Like, what are the odds? Because scalariforms are unusual signs. It's not like they appear all over the place, right? What are the odds that in the north we've got one that's dating quite old, and then in the south, right where the Neanderthals were hanging out, directly above there is this faded old red scalariform. I'm like, oh my gosh, that was that moment where I was like, maybe it isn't such an outlier. Because that was always kind of, I was like, the scalariform's a little weird compared to the other ones, but maybe it's not, right? And so this is where I truly think with the database going forward, like, we need to actually add another species. Isn't that an incredible concept? That like they genuinely need their own, like they have their own culture of art and their own repertoire of symbols that they could make. And I mean, again, like if you look at like portable pieces like from burials, like La Ferracie and stuff like that, where they've got all the engraved cupels, like it might be one of those ones. I was just actually talking to Lee Berger from Rising Star the other day, and we were talking about that idea about you don't find what you're not looking for. And so if you assume Neanderthals can, and I don't mean this like you go looking to try and make the evidence squish it. What I mean is that like down in South Africa, what we were talking about was with the old stuff at Blombos, right? Like the ochres and with the marks on it and stuff. Once that got published, it was like suddenly people like were looking at the surrounding sites and they were like, oh wait, there's marks at Classes Rivermouth. There's marks at Pinnacle Point. Like there's all like there are more, but if you assume up front, well, Neanderthals can't make symbolic marks. If we see markings on something, it must be because they were butchering something. They must be marks to do with butchering. You're not, your mind's not open to it, I think is maybe what it is. And so I think part of it was literally has been that because, you know, even when I was an undergrad, like they were just starting to talk about earlier art in Africa. Like that was that big 2000 paper was the big one where they first were like, hey, you know, maybe this wasn't a big explosion in Europe at 35,000, right? But like literally that was what I was being taught at first was more like 35,000 years ago, art was invented, right? And it invented in Europe. So this is before the Indonesian stuff. This is before the old dates out of Australia. You know, and by the way, Neanderthals, A, are not related to us, and B, they didn't make art, right? So like that's not that long ago. Like what, 15,
Yeah,
like something like that. So I mean, the ground under us in paleoanthropology has shifted, right? And
absolutely.
yeah, which to me is what makes it so fun. Yeah, the 55,000-year-old dates are super cool. Again, I think what we don't know, I think what we don't know vastly outweighs what we do know. And so that's what just why it's such a great time to be a paleontologist. But
Absolutely.
yeah, but even at 55,000, yeah, those 65,000-year-old dates are 10,000 years earlier. So we're talking about the like there's nobody else there. That was what was so
Yeah.
paradigm shifting about this. Yeah, so that's probably some helpful background info is that before this, it was always possible to say, well, there was humans there too, so probably it was the humans who made it, right? My
Right.
colleague Amy Chase and I, we gave a paper probably about 3 or 4 years now ago, saying about the fact that with Neanderthals, like we keep moving the goalposts, like in the sense that if we had this level of evidence for humans making art at a site, everybody'd be like, "Oh yeah, the humans did it." Like the
Right.
fight is because it's this new species, and I think the big thing is alluding to what you were talking about with that the checklist of modernity, right? Like art was the last thing on that list. We were out of
Yeah.
stuff,
Yeah.
right? Like truly, because at first it was like, well, in order to be modern, we make tools, we talk, we bury our dead, we wear jewelry, like we make little artifacts, like all of those things. Literally, other species are like check, 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 check. Like we were down to art was like the last thing that made us special. And I think so
Right.
much of this goes back to that sort of time of like in the 1800s and that sense of but we are special, right? And that
Mhm.
distancing of us from the natural world. So it's I feel like it's kind of part of the whole scarcity mindset versus abundance, right? Which is that
Right.
I think you and I are more like there's lots of room at the table for all the species. Like let's find out what they did, as opposed to you can't come to our table because this is the cool kids table. Um, and so I feel like part of it is that, as silly as that sounds,
Hmm.
is they're like, well, but I'm like our ancestors interbred with these people. Like one would hope they had some skills, right? You know, like
Right.
I'm almost 4% Neanderthal on my mom's side. Isn't that amazing? So,
Yeah.
but my
Yeah.
ancestors really liked their Neanderthal counterparts.
A
Uh,
parent. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So, oh, and I'm like over 2% Denisovan on my dad's side. How interesting is that? Very
That is
unusual.
very interesting.
Yes. So I was like, oh, we must have done like a fun little detour through Asia before this particular Y line came into Europe. But you know, so
Right.
I think so much of it is that, yeah, traditionally it was always like the caves were caves like La Ferracie, right? So La Ferracie is a cave in France where Neanderthals lived there, humans lived there, Neanderthals, humans, like there's archaeological layers for both. So if you're dealing with caves like that, people automatically defaulted to, oh, well, the humans made the art, obviously,
Right.
right? And they made it after they arrived in Europe and invented it. And so it was always that sense of our poor, slightly dim-witted Neanderthal cousins who never quite figured it out, or maybe they learned like monkey see, monkey do. Like the humans
Right.
arrived, and then maybe they learned to make some bling because they were like, "Ooh, that's a pretty necklace. Maybe we should do that."
That was actually the next thing I wanted to bring up because I
Okay,
wanted to say so. One of the hypotheses was, as you just
mhm.
mentioned, they were Neanderthals. Modern humans came in,
Yeah,
and the Neanderthal copied what they were seeing, created
yeah,
art.
yeah.
I don't know if this would even be possible to determine at this point, but is there any pattern you've seen of where Neanderthal art did get more advanced when modern humans came in, or can you not differentiate at that point?
Well,
Or
I think that's such an interesting question though, because sorry, what was the word you just used? Like the where it got more not more sophisticated. Was that the word you used?
yeah, more like complex, more advanced,
But
I
but think
guess.
about that, right? Think about what we're saying when we say that term, right?
Right.
I know, and I love
Exactly.
you, and I say it with love, and I'm just using it more as a really good example for the audience, not trying to, because I say that too. I catch myself with that whole like it's more developed, it's more this, it's more that. what was the purpose of it, right?
Right.
If it was, and I think this is where, just to slightly jump into the future to come back to the past, so this makes sense. If we think about writing, right? Like this is the thing, is that often because of our background, again, embedded in the 1800s, in the Victorian era, in the concept of like Darwinism and like the sense of like we're working towards perfection. Like I think there's almost like, I always think of pyramids, right? Like who's at the apex?
Right.
We have apex predators, we have apex this, we have apex that, right? So let's go to writing for a second, because writing is the grandchild of these symbols, right? Like these symbols, and I mean, that's why they're so cool, is that this was literally our deep ancestors, both human and related, first starting to learn how to communicate using visual symbols. It's amazing, right? And so again, in later times, some civilizations created something called a writing system. So cuneiform, hieroglyphs, early Chinese script, the Maya did an amazing job in the New World. So we've got these examples. Now, in a full writing system, you can say anything you can think, and you can write that, right? Like that's full cognitive language, orally, full capacity to communicate, then transmitted into writing, that you can write anything that you can speak, right? So that's kind of where there's grammar, there's syntax, there's rules.
Right.
You then need full-time specialists to manage that system for you, though, right? Because in order to enforce those rules, you need dictionaries, teachers, students. It's a whole profession, right? And so this is where I mean, it's so like funny and deflating at once, which is that pretty much everywhere where they started writing like a proper writing system, it's pretty much all to do with taxation, laws, economic transactions, and occasionally some religious texts. But like so much of
Isn't the Rosetta Stone literally
it's a contract, right?
Yeah.
Or treaty. I think it's a treaty. It's at least as interesting as a treaty. But like so much of it, you're like, this is so deflating that like we learned, right? They invent these wonderful systems, and then they're busy like there's 3 bushels of wheat and like 4 sheep, and we traded this many pieces of silver for like that's, you're like, well, there we go. I mean, I thought a really funny cuneiform tablet where they were getting paid in beer. That was hilarious. Because I was like, oh, that's so fun. Nothing changes. Hey, I was like construction workers too, I think, and they were getting paid in beer. But so that's a full writing system. This is designed to move between city states. This is designed, again, with these big populations living in these urban settings where you need to transmit a set of rules to a large group of people. And these are how you do these things. I hate to say it, but it's a bit of an instrument of control of the state. If you've got 30 to 50 hunter-gatherers hanging out, do you need a full writing system? What would you use it for? You don't need it. Anything you got to say, you can tell people. Or if you're wanting to communicate with the tribes in the vicinity, you probably meet up with them and talk to them. Like yes, it's important to have symbols. Symbols are going to be of very significant use to you, but they're going to be clan signs. They're going to be important concepts to you. Maybe something related to religion. Maybe something related to hunting for sure. Like I suspect, again, you've got a wide variety of stuff. Like I don't think there's one explanation that will ever cover it all, right? But I think that's where what we have to be so careful of is that there is literally no situation where it would make sense for groups of 30 to 50 people to invent a full writing system. It would be such a waste of their time. And so writing is not an end goal or somehow better or like more civilized. It's more that writing is useful in certain situations with certain groups of people who organize their lives in certain ways is the best way to think about it, right?
And that's why today even there are people who don't have written language.
Well, they don't really need it. What do they need it for?
And they get along just fine. They don't need them.
And they all have graphic symbols, or they have like physical objects that they like, the talking sticks, for instance, were the first people in Australia, like super sophisticated information, but they weren't trying to, write the regulations out for like, when people can walk a donkey through the street, or I don't know, like there's all sorts of funny little things on these tablets. So I think with the symbols as well. So that was a super long side trip. So thank you for joining me on our road trip there. All to go back to say though, that maybe the symbols the Neanderthals were using were working really well for them, and they didn't need anything else. Like, I think
Good
that's
point.
where,
Yeah,
right? Like we're not, it's not like they were like, like we're so end goal focused, I think, in Western civilization, that we presume that there's always like bigger, better, worse, and again, that's what I mean. That's not any critique against any of us, because I do it too. I catch myself talking about developing, and then I'm like, well, I'd be careful about that, because it is developing
right.
for sure, but it doesn't mean that what came before it was less good, I think, is maybe what I'm saying.
Exactly.
It's more like
Yeah,
what is situationally useful. And frankly, if you go back to evolutionary theory and thinking about it that way, they are doing exactly what they need in their particular situations. So they are being very evolutionarily successful,
exactly.
maybe with
Yeah,
the smaller set of symbols. So I think, again, a perfect example to me of that, the simplicity of a shape does not necessarily denote the simplicity of its meaning. So I'm going to
right.
use, for an example, like a Christian cross. It's
Hmm.
literally two sticks, right?
Right.
So in the future, if people looked at that, they would be like, well, those guys didn't really know what they were doing, right? Like, they were still in that pre-writing phase. And yet, if you understand the amount of cultural knowledge embedded in that
Hmm.
tiny symbol, I mean, it literally unlocks the last 2,000 years of Western civilization for you.
Yeah,
Like, it's
it's a very
bonkers.
good point. Yeah,
Ah, so I think that that's where this is where presentism is so tough. Hey, so presentism for the viewers is like when you accidentally bring your own like 21st century glasses to looking into the deep past. You're looking through those lenses, and so I think that's where we all do the best we can, and I fall into it sometimes too. But trying to sort of imagine, well, and especially with Neanderthals too, even if their minds are similar, they're kind of aliens in a crazy
right.
way. Because I mean, what was the last proteomic stuff? Wasn't it around 700,000 years ago? I think that we split from them, right? I think it was around 700,000.
About
Yeah,
six, seven
right.
hundred
Yeah, and
thousand.
then
Yeah.
Sima de los Huesos, I think they split from Denisovans around 450, 430,
Hmm.
450,000.
Hmm.
Yeah. So for 600,000 plus years, we didn't meet them again. Like, they went
Yeah.
and did their thing, we did our thing, which also makes really interesting questions about how old those first marks, like who really made the first marks, right? That's a whole other
Right.
conversation we have to have
Yeah.
sometime. But they were doing their own thing, our ancestors were doing their own thing, and so when they met again, they're similar minds, but they're not necessarily the same. And so I'm always trying to wrap my head around that too, right? It's kind of like, do you know what I mean? Like there's that sense of,
Absolutely. And
so
I
cool.
think when you're talking about that parasitism thing, I mean, no human alive today or for the last 30, 40,000 years
Nope.
knows what it's like to communicate or think about what another human species would do. Like, I mean, think of just having a conversation with a Neanderthal. Say they knew English, which they probably could if someone taught them,
Yeah.
and it's just like, what would you talk about? I mean, it's what would they see as the same? What would they see as different? This is what gets me going, the paleoneurology of it all and how it all
Mhm.
just,
Yes.
our brains and how they work and why, and just
Yeah.
art is definitely, as you said, it was a much later addition to our cognition,
Yeah.
but it unlocks, I think, a window into what the heck is going on in there.
Yep. That's exactly how I use that as my analogy all the time. So I'm right there with you, which is that it is a window into their mind, because this is not just about behavior. There's the thought that's driving the behavior is not, I need to make a tool so I can go catch a bison, right? Like, or
Right.
like there's, why are they doing this? Like, what is it about this that is so important that they're putting time and resources towards it? Obviously, it was effective for them in some reason too. Like, it was evolutionarily, if you want to go back to that, like there was a reason to keep making these symbols that was helpful,
Right.
and that basically furthered their ability to live good lives and sort of function well on the planet. So I think that's where. But the other thing is too, of course, is that we are so limited by the materials we have left. right?
Absolutely.
Like I think the what we call taphonomic processes in the field. So taphonomic processes is what degrades when, how fast does it fall apart? Like, this is the thing. The Romans, we have books. We got tons of books. They write about themselves all the
Yeah.
time. And even then there's stuff we don't know, but we can get a lot of insight.
Yeah.
The Egyptians left texts and they left pyramids. Like they left stuff for us to go look at, right? And I think that's always the big thing with this field is that we got the bones and the stones. Like
Yeah.
our sites are very minimal on the landscape, right? And so
Mhm.
it's like the ultimate mystery though, right? Because we are literally trying to
Absolutely.
rebuild civilizations out of the tiniest clues. I came up with a really good analogy the other day. I was really excited, so I'm going to use it with you. It's like we're peeking through the keyhole of a door and we're trying to
Yes.
rebuild the entire room,
Absolutely. I think
right?
that is a beautiful
Isn't that a
analogy.
great one? And I was like, yes, that's
Yes.
literally what we're doing, and we're doing the best we can. But
Mhm.
that's where we have to recognize what we don't know far outweighs what we do. You
Are
know?
exceeding. Yeah.
Yes, and I mean again, and then we get these really cool surprises, which like that. Did you see that crazy totem pole they pulled out of a peat bog in Russia recently?
I did. Yes.
Seriously. Okay, so for the viewers, it's actually 14,000 years old. I think now they've carbon dated it to around
Mhm.
14,000. It's 17 feet tall now that they've rebuilt it. It has the most uncanny face engraved on the top. The entire shaft of the totem pole, though, is geometric signs. And they think it was right beside a lake in Siberia, and they're wondering because they found remnants of them at other bogs. They think maybe this was a thing, like that they marked the water maybe with some sort of water spirit, some sort of, maybe it's ownership,
Mhm.
maybe it's blessing, like who knows what it is, right? But again, all that wood didn't survive normally. What if they were doing
Right.
things on animal skins? What about decorating their own skin, right? Like we have no idea what they were.
Exactly.
So the things that we're finding are like these basically again these tiny pieces of their culture, and we don't know what their full repertoire is. Like if you look at, say, even just like human paleo stuff, paleo art in Europe, what they're doing on the walls is not as intricate as what you see on those amazing artifacts, like the portable pieces. Some of
Right.
those portable pieces are so finely decorated with so much detail, and there's so much going on, and there's like whole stories going on some of those, right? Like it's incredible. Or like the really decorated ones that somebody was asking me about, which have like spirals and concentric circles, like the intricate level of decoration, you just can't do that on a wall in a cave. Like it's not the right medium, right? So I think that's
Right.
the other thing too, is that what we have left is these sort of really cool time capsules, which is basically what a cave is, because it preserves better.
Mhm.
But like
Ex-
the we don't know what the outside of the Paleolithic world looked like.
Exactly. And, you know, one thing that goes exactly along with what you're saying is so many people like, oh, cave art it's so rare, it's beautiful, it's amazing. How much rock art was lost
Yeah,
because of the weather, because of weathering?
yeah.
I mean,
Or just covered with a bunch of dirt and trees now, right?
yeah,
Like
exactly. A
literally,
bush could just be covering, who
we have no
knows?
idea,
It's
right? Oh yeah, no, I think that that's the reality is that, and I think for me, Fusco in Portugal is really important. Ciega Verde too, up right on the Spanish border
Mhm.
near there, because these rare conditions allowed the preservation of the external art. And there's literally
Right.
like, I think there's like thousands of images on like several hundred rock art panels. Like there's lots.
Hmm.
And I remember standing there, and so they lived. These are up. They're basically these really fun sort of valleys with like
Hmm.
pieces of really hard. It's called schist rock. So again, survives really well as opposed to soft limestone, for instance, right? Schist is
Right.
very hard. It's hard to carve into, but what you carve is going to survive better because it's such a tougher material. So standing beside a little stream that's right by the Koa River, this is like one of the little side streams, and with my colleagues, with like Thierry and Andre and all the guys Luis who do such great work there, and they were showing me this is the site, this is where people live. You look around, all those schist blocks are up on the sides right there in plain sight. And when they were new, that would have been standing out as white against this brownish red rock. It would have been very clear. Yes. So that's the thing, is that they lived in a decorated world. Like, it changed that trip to Fochkoa changed my entire perspective on the caves, because I was like, okay, I'm seeing the same stuff we see in the caves. Like, the caves are not these special magical places away from the world.
Yeah,
they might be partially.
Exactly.
But I'm seeing the same stuff out in the open where, every person in a community just had to look up, from the little babies to like the elderly folks. Everybody could just look around and see it all for themselves, right? Men, women, there's no
It's
separation.
amazing. Yeah.
And I was like, oh, we've lost so much. Like, that was that moment where I was like, oh wow, it's a fraction of a fraction is what we have left.
Absolutely.
Yep. And it's one of the things I find super interesting, and I think we could finish here and like drive your viewers wild. It's why I've started working in places like the Middle East. So you see, the problem in Europe, of course, is back in the day, this was a tundra. It was open, there was like little bushes, but think of it as more being like a northern cold savanna style, right? Like big herds of animals, all that kind of thing. So the limestone formations would have been more open and visible, all these rock surfaces, all these different things. Plus, again, there might have been wooden carvings, there might have been paintings on the outside. I guarantee there was like boundary markers and messages people were sending to each other all throughout the landscape. Then the weather changes, the ice sheets roll back, water levels rise, dirt lands there, right? There's dirt everywhere, trees are planted, there's whole forests. Again, I mean, when you dig down to get to some of these sites, like, you have to go a long way down. Like
Right.
once you're up to like 30, 40, 50,000 years, it can be a bit of a, so it's almost like an accident when you find a site. Like, not quite. In some cases, I think people use predictive modeling or whatever, but it's almost like a, oh wow, look what we stumbled across because somebody was digging up X or Y, right? Now, so that's the big problem, is that there could literally be the most incredible site ever under your feet and you wouldn't know. Happens, I'm sure it happens all the time. Or kind of like all the caves where they're like, I feel a breeze on my ankle and there's Chauvet, right? Like, we have no clue what's right behind this rock wall. So this is where it's again, this is all part of the fun and the mystery of it, right? But also what makes it challenging. In the Middle East, we have this really rare situation where back in the day, this was more like the savannah as well. So it was more like a big open plain style Serengeti. As the ice sheets receded, what happens is it changes all the environments. All the environments move with the ice sheets. So when the ice sheets are low, the tundra, the boreal forest, like everything's just pushed south, but all the same environments exist. As they go back up, they move. So that area in the Middle East got hotter, drier, turned into a desert. Part of the process of a desert is that the dirt dries up and gets blown away by the wind. So what you end up with are these incredible things called relic fields, which is where, for instance, I got to see my first relic fields about a year ago. And so what it is like there's really good source of flint, right? So people go to use this source of flint in the vicinity. They make their tools, they do their things, they throw stuff, they discard the pieces they're not using. It's, it does the normal thing over time, gets covered by dirt, more people show up later, 10,000 years later, they use it too, whatever, right? But then the dirt gets blown away and the tools go bang and they drop to the desert floor. And it's literally like it was like walking on a carpet of tools, basically. It blew my mind. And I was like, oh, wow, okay. Right? Like, because then you really realize like how much could just be sitting anywhere we wouldn't know.
Right.
And then also, because the desert, those sorts of environments, both in Abu Dhabi and in Jordan, where I've been working in the last couple of years, they don't have all the trees and the dirt, like everything. And so the rock art's still visible if it's engraved, right? And you can still really clearly see cave entrances because they're not obscured by things, right? And so I think this is where these other environments are also going to be really important to helping us figure out clues to like the sort of the story of us is to realize that in Europe, again, we got great people working, we're coming up with cool things. I was actually using a thermal imaging drone this past year
Wow.
right? You know why? So caves are always around 12 to 15 degrees Celsius. I'm sorry, I don't know what that is in
Right.
Fahrenheit, but they're coolish. How's that? You might want a sweater. It's sweater weather. So again, if you do it in summer, the surrounding temperature is really hot. The cave shows as a cold spot. Or you could do it at night when it's really cold, and the cave will show as a warm bloom, right?
Mm.
So there are ways to go looking for cave mouths. There are ways to expand. As you can see again, the surveyor in me is always busy plotting and planning fun ways to go find new stuff. Because I think that's the key. Is it's like every cave I've worked in, there's new things to learn. There's things to even, and I think that's where so many researchers now are revisiting some of those caves that like people surveyed them like 100 years ago, 50 years ago, even, but they didn't have the tech we do now, right? You go into those
Right.
caves now with some of the tools we have at our disposal, you can find new art panels, like things that you didn't even know were
Exactly.
there
Yeah.
and that you aren't visible really with the naked eye. And you can see them using special lights and using post-processing software. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that that's it, there's such a funny sense, I think, sometimes that like the whole world has been mapped and explored and like everything's been done.
Yeah.
And it's like in this, I can't speak to other fields, but I will say in this field, like we have barely scratched the surface.
Yeah.
And
Seriously.
and there's not that many of us even working in the field. Like this is not a crowded field, like by any means either. So, I really hope, I think that's one of the things, you and I have talked about this a bit, and we can definitely talk about it more in the future. So I think we do need to do like a series or something. It'd be so fun.
Yeah,
Is that
for sure.
cool? Is that the idea that there's art all over the world. And these aren't blank spots on the map. Because right now it's like we've got the blob in Europe, there's the big set in Europe. We've got the stuff now in Indonesia, which is amazing. We've got stuff in Australia. These are all Pleistocene. Now we're getting some Pleistocene stuff in North America, I would like to think, and South America. But there are these little spots and there's all this blank stuff in between. But my argument would be they're not blank. It just hasn't been filled in yet. And I don't even want to say that they're not discovered because I think there's a lot of places where the local people already know they exist. It's just that
Right.
there's no
Absolutely.
resources and nobody's asked. And maybe they don't have like the dating techniques to know exactly how old they are, but they know there's old paintings or they know there's old engravings around them. And I think
Absolutely.
everywhere I've worked, people are super curious about the history in their area. They'd love to know more. So I feel like that really needs to be one of the things in this amazing age now where like I think we shouldn't be gatekeeping this. I think we need to be figuring out how to open this up and how to encourage more citizen scientists to come and join us and to help fill in
Absolutely.
those blank spots on the map. Because I mean, certainly from my own slightly selfish perspective, I would like to understand the global patterns of how people and ideas moved around the planet. And I,
Absolutely.
would
Yeah.
be incredible. And I think it
Oh,
all goes back to that moment of like, oh my God, this didn't start here. Like that was that master's moment when like the hair on the back of
yeah.
my neck, and I was like, where did this come from? So to be able to track, and this is where the signs are so cool, is to be able to track them across time and space would just be amazing. But we have the tools to do it now. And so, I mean, like, who knows what the future holds, right? So there you go.
Yeah.
I've talked your ear off, so I should stop now. And we've only barely touched on signs and things. There's so much we can talk about, but I should stop there so we don't, can't go all day.
That, there really is so much more to talk about. So I
Yes.
really think we should, if not a series, at least maybe a few more episodes
Heck
on
yeah.
this. But I think that will be a good place to leave off for everyone. A lot of mystery, a lot of intrigue.
I know.
And since we will be doing future episodes, if anyone has questions that they would like to ask, please either private message me on Twitter, Facebook. You can email me at worldofpaleoanthropology@gmail.com, and I'll be sure to ask, and we'll discuss, and we'll have some fun. So I'd
Yeah.
just like to thank Genevieve so much for coming on. It has been an absolute blast.
I know, isn't it? Well, I mean, I think it's both of our favorite subjects. So I mean, it's not hard to get really excited about it. No, I feel so honored and blessed to get to do what I do, and to know that I mean, again, that like I said, I've gotten to work in so many incredible places, and it's it's such a pleasure too to share it. Like I think for me that's half the fun is that like I just want to tell everybody about it because this is the story of us. And we all I think we all have things to contribute too. So this is where I'd love to hear, people's questions, people's comments. I'm always super interested in that. And I have some really fun adventures coming up and some really cool stuff we're not allowed to talk about yet, which Seth knows about. So hopefully some cool stuff to be able to announce in the coming months as well. So thank you so
That
much
would be
for having
awesome.
me on the show. It was such a pleasure to be here.
It was amazing to have you. And I will add one more thing because I
Yes.
forgot to mention it. You do have a TED Talk that is on YouTube
Yes.
that goes over a lot of the geometric signs and what we're
Yeah.
talking about.
Yeah.
So if you just look up Genevieve von Petzinger on YouTube, it's probably one of the top things. Watch it. It's great. All right,
Awesome. Thank
guys.
you.
We will see you next time.
Bye.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Story of Us, where we interview and talk to researchers who are doing the work in the field. We hope that you learned something, as there's always more to learn, and please stay tuned to the next episode, which will be airing in a couple of weeks. Be sure to check out our merch store, and, it never hurts to leave a tip. So, thank you for learning, and see you next time.